Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Reynolds. I want to thank the City of Stuart for hosting us here in this great facility. We have a very busy agenda, and so my job is to try and keep us on track so that we can provide as much information as possible during this informational briefing and discussion about water management across South Florida. We have a large number of elected officials with us today, so I apologize in advance if I miss anyone or I mispronounce anyone's names. So we have, in no particular order, State Representative Aaron Grahl, State Representative Gail Harrell, Mayor Melissa McKinley from Palm Beach County, Commissioner Ed Fielding, Commissioner Sarah Hurd, City Commissioner Becky Bruner, Councilwoman Holly Smith, Mayor of City of Sanibel Kevin Ruane, Mayor Kelly Layton, thank you for hosting us today, County Commissioner Bob Solari, Commissioner Jackie Sherlow-Lippish, and representing Senator Rubio's office, Greg Langowski. Are there any other elected officials that I missed? Oh, and John Hall from Senator Nelson's office as well. So thank you for being here with us. There are also a large number of people representing other agencies and other organizations, and I am woefully inappropriately prepared to announce all of them. So just recognize that we do know many of you here in the room, and we appreciate all of your support and collaboration as we work through this multitude of issues that we're going to talk about today. So thank you all for being here. We have a panel in front of us, and I will just introduce them briefly so that those who are not in the room and are watching from home or who are unfortunately outside, we have hundreds of people outside of this venue for those who are watching at home or online. So we have Congressman Brian Mast, Colonel Jason Kirk from the Corps of Engineers, Executive Director Ernie Marks from the South Florida Water Management District, also from the South Florida Water Management District Governing Board, Mr. Brandon Tucker. From the Department of Interior, Mr. Scott Cameron, the Deputy Assistant Secretary. We have Mr. Larry Williams from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Mr. Drew Bartlett from Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and the incoming commander, my new boss, from the Jacksonville District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Colonel Drew Kelly. Without further ado, I will turn the microphone over to Colonel Kirk.
Colonel Reynolds, thank you for helping moderate this session, and I want to thank you for all the work that you do down here to help our team communicate throughout the year on the work that we do in water management. Congressman Mast, thanks for the invite and the discussions that led up to this meeting. Mr. Cameron, your agency had a hand in getting this set up in the last couple of weeks. Thank you for that, sir. For all of you, what I want you to know that Congressman Mast and I, both with meetings in D.C. and our almost weekly phone calls and communications, nowadays text messages, that we have been and stay in constant communication about what is going on in your city, in your district. And I appreciate your accessibility as we together work through the challenges, which this year presented themselves mostly in the form of record high rains in May, and then all that's come after. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about that in follow-up to some specific questions that you've had to us both in writing and in other fora. So please go to the next slide. We're going to talk first and foremost, I know many of the residents of this particular area in Martin County and in Stuart are interested first and foremost in knowing why does the Corps, why does Colonel Kirk do periodic discharges to the estuary, and how may we be able to limit those estuarine discharges. So we're going to talk about that. we're going to talk about the 2008 regulation schedule. That's the book sitting in front of me. We'll talk about that and how it informs our decision-making process. We'll talk about the risk. You've asked her about some of the risk, both on the high and the low ends of the lake. So with my partner in water management, Ernie March to my left, we'll talk you through that. And then we'll talk about some very important initial thoughts that I want to make clear to all the folks here, the public here, about the revision of this book sitting in front of me and how we need you to be a part of that. So in fact, we have a different schedule at a point in the future. Next slide. So I'm your Army Corps of Engineer commander. You guys, depending on how long you've been in this business, in this environment, you've seen 5 or 6 or 7 guys like me sitting up here. And you know that we come from wherever in the United States. You know, I was born in Chicago, lived in Louisiana. I did marry a 8th generation Floridian. My wife's from Sarasota. My daughter's 9th generation, born in Gainesville. But what I do as an Army officer is generally follow the rules set before me, whether it's a division op order like I followed with the 1st Armored Division in Iraq for 2 years, or in the case here of a 2008 Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, which is the op order or the battle book that I use to execute the mission here. And so what that says, what this book says, and many of you were in the rooms in 05, 06, 07 when we pulled this thing together, is it says, and this is a quote, that integrity of the Herbert Hoover dike is the dominant factor in the decision-making process throughout the season with LORs. It also says that this publicly derived document is highlighted on the bottom there, the best operational compromise that could be developed in 2008. So that's what the battle book is. Next slide. So what the Corps strives to do, and Congressman, I think you and I sat down and looked at this well over a year ago, because I'll tell you, you know, we deal with congressmen across the state without a doubt, and all of them do it, but I've probably spent more time talking the details and helping Congressman Mast understand this system as he works to represent all of you. And so we talked through what are ultimately some competing tensions and requirements. And so sitting here today, most of you in the room and just outside the room are interested in that top right box. And I call this, you know, essentially this was my common operating picture that I sketched out in really the first couple months here to understand the competing tensions that are going on. On Wednesday, I was right in the center of the project. I was with constituents that are most concerned about the integrity of the dike. And then Wednesday afternoon, I was actually out on the Caloosahatchee estuary, and we were standing on Fort Myers Beach, where they're most interested in issues to the West Coast. So each and every day, including the 8 million people that are affected by some of the water supply concerns, your Army Corps of Engineers, your Water Management District are working to balance the competing interests that guide our federal and state decision making. That's what we do. Next slide. So a bit of an after-action review. So how did we get to where we're at today on August 17th? So here's what we had in early January, because you've asked some questions, Congressman, about lake levels throughout the year and why high at this time and low at this time. So just a little bit of where we were. So in early January, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration forecast told Ernie and I that we are heading into a drought. We actually had stakeholders, the third bullet there says, on January 9th, the Caloosahatchee stakeholders asked me for more water. Send more water to the Caloosahatchee. Because of that forecast, and go to the next slide, because of our goal, per the battle book, to safely operate the lake between 12.5 and 15.5 throughout the year, on January 9th, expecting a trajectory to actually get to that gold star 12.5 by June 1st, by the hurricane season, which is what my op order tells me to do, I told the Caloosahatchee stakeholders, you're not getting more water. to get to where we're supposed to, we're going to hold per the schedule. So at the time, just kind of appreciate the tension. So on January 9th and 10th, I have folks clamoring for me to not follow the battle book and send more water to the west. Now, you all know the last many weeks, I've had many, many constituents clamoring for me to not follow the battle book and stop sending water to the west and stop sending water to the east. And I appreciate the passion and the intensity of those calls, because I know there's second and third order consequences, but there's a reason for, and what I hope is that through this dialogue that not only you, sir, but all of the constituents better understand why we do what we do. Then we had something happen that was unexpected. It was not in the NOAA forecast. It was the highest period of record ever rains in the month of May, over 11 inches. That changed the dynamic. Next slide. So now I've got that big rain cloud. I've got 3 times normal rain. And, not surprisingly, in June, with nutrients in the lake, some of which has been there for over 100 years, with Hurricane Irma that had stirred up the lake, Lore's now told us to do discharges. So we could safely manage the lake through the hurricane season. Lore's actually told me to do discharges the 3rd week of May. I used a little bit of discretion that we have, and before your Memorial Day weekend, we didn't start discharges. Because what is also impacted by discharges? This thing called tourism, right? I heard from 5 chambers of commerce 2 days ago on the West Coast. So we didn't do discharges before Memorial Day weekend. We used operational flexibility before Memorial Day weekend. But then on June 1st, I started estuarine discharges. But we didn't just start estuarine discharges. Ernie and I and our teams were in a room. All those yellow lines are actual deviations from the standard schedule. Some of which, Mr. Al Lee is a senior executive, deputy commander for our region in Atlanta. When I deviate from this battle book, similar to what I did in Iraq, I go to my division commander to get approval. And so many of those lines, we had active communications with Atlanta. Ernie's guys, my guys, are putting on their thinking caps to figure out what we can do. I see James Erston from Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Many of the folks in this room, Drew was in the room, FWCC was in the room, Larry was in the room, Drew, Ernie and I were together in the 3rd week of May, meeting to talk about this campaign that we were working our way through. And I assure you, through the course of these weeks, we found a couple of more yellow lines. We finished some major construction in the very south end of the system. It's called C-111 South Dade. And we have moved water everywhere else but the estuaries whenever we could. I assure you that. And we're not done. We are continuing to look for pockets. FWCC had a closure of Conservation Area 3 Alpha, which is a big, big deal to some people. And there was a closure for about 6 weeks. They've actually come off of that now because we've gotten water out of that area. And so that speed bump to moving water south now has a little more room in it. And Ernie and I are going to use every bit that we can. Let's go to the next slide. So where are we now? Now that, I just, on my way up here, I called Commissioner Cecil Pendergrass, my West Coast chairman, to tell him where we're at. I knew I'd be able to talk to the East Coast right here in person. But where we're at today, Lore's right now is right on the edge. It's actually, just science is telling me to increase discharges yesterday. But I'm not doing that. I'm going to hold, because sometimes what will happen is the math will tell me to go up 1 week and down the next week. And that's not good. You guys know, when you hear that, Jackie may be on the line on Tuesday. She knows what's being talked about. And we have these maybe not necessary spikes. So as we make these decisions, we try to level it out. But I may need to go up next week. But if I do it, it'll be because it needs to go up for several weeks. That yellow star today, we're not yet at the peak of the hurricane season. Yet we're over 14.5. So what's in my sight picture is just before Hurricane Irma, which you all remember, it had less of an effect on the East Coast than it did on, of course, the Keys and the Southwest Florida. But we were at 13.8 on September 6th, which was uncomfortably high on September 6th. And I'll probably never forget that phone call with Governor Scott when I told him where the risk level was. The NOAA forecast had just told us we had a Cat 4 coming at us that at that time said it was going to ride the lake, which starts to get into worst case scenario. And so with that information, the governor instituted an evacuation order for tens of thousands of people south of the lake at 13.8 on September 6th. Today, we're over 14.5 on August 17th. So that's an uncomfortable place. So what it means is we will still have estuarine discharges for the next several weeks. And, you know, as a leader who cares a lot about this business, you know, and the way the Army goes rolling along, Colonel Drew Kelly will be the commander dealing with Hurricane X if it comes in October. And I think I have a sacred responsibility just with that dynamic that's maybe even a little bit different if I was going to be the guy in October to get it right. So that's the present day. I told you about the 10 deviations that we've done. Those green arrows mean that those yellow arrows are now in effect. And go ahead to the next slide. So what if we held the lake higher? What does that mean? And I know, Congressman Mast, that's been one of your central questions. And I started the discussion with Loers tells me that dam safety is paramount. So what could happen? You know, here's the book out of the library down the hall from my office. It's about the 1927 floods. And there's another book about the 1947 floods. And I've stood in front of the plaque, as many of you have, that talk about the 2,000 lives lost south of the lake. It is my responsibility, the responsibility of the Corps of Engineers, to ensure that never happens again. So the math, the science, the professional judgment that we are putting into play each and every day, knowing that we have what at times are harmful estuarine discharges because there's algae in it, which, as Mr. Cameron will mention, we're tracking in 13 states across the country right now. We have to let the water out. Now, the good news, and I won't steal his thunder because my battle buddy in this effort, Ernie Marks, is going to talk about some of the incredibly important, well along the way, work in Everglades restoration that's going to create new variables in this equation, that's going to give us different, better options for all of us, for folks that are sitting in my chair in the future. So at this point, Ernie, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Colonel. Congressman, thank you for having us here today, and thank you for hosting us. Really appreciate it. It's for those of you who don't know me, I have been working not in water management, but on Everglades issues for about 14 years. So I'm going to have to project like the Colonel. How's that work? I have to pretend I'm talking to my kids after they do something they're not supposed to do. But no, I've spent about 14 years working on this system in numerous forms and fashions. I had worked for DEP for almost a decade. I worked for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I'm familiar with the issues that they've struggled with over time. And then, of course, my work at South Florida and the various positions I've held there. I've got a lot of history with this system. I am not, it's something that we inherited. Our agency is almost 70 years old now, and so we're looking at a system that was put in place for 2 million people that now serves about 8.1. So there's a lot of work that we have to do going forward. I will tell you one thing, and I'm hopeful that we're going to get to a better place, because we have gotten a lot of support lately. We've gotten a lot of support at the state level. Governor Scott has had a great initiative with restoration strategies and the funding that he's been seeking to get SERP projects underway. We know that there is more work to be done on the federal side. We've got some work to do there, and it's not for a lack of trying from folks. There's multiple competing interests across 50 states. And so I think that's something that folks need to, when we're talking about solutions and trying to provide solutions, is something that folks need to keep in mind, because everybody's voice counts. And we need to make sure that when we're working with our congressperson, when we're working with our senators, that we're giving them the message of what they need to do so that we can get the funding, so that we can change the status quo of where we are today. Now, the Colonel talked to you a little bit about where we were in January or so. I'm going to just take a step back and talk a little bit about what happens when you manage the lake lower. So, next slide, John. So let's take a little look at the history. So the lake wasn't always managed where it is now. John, there's an animation here if you do one click. Before lures, there was water supply and environment, where the upper end was a little higher and the lower end was a little lower. And before water supply and environment, there was Run 25, where the lake was held a lot higher. And so you'll see over time that blue line shows us how we've managed the lake to a lower level. If you look at the red line, you'll see that going across 11. That's the minimum flow level for Lake Okeechobee. That was based on science contributed by all of the agencies that we've talked about here today, as well as many others, by scientists, universities, and working through numerous public meetings to establish. That red line that you see at number 8 is where we can no longer send water south. What I want to focus people on, thanks John, what I want to focus people on is 2 events. The first one, that's highlighted there in the black oval, looks at a time period in which we had 3 high water years, and then we both relied on Mother Nature as well as operation of the system to drive the lake down, purposefully. Now, what happened when we got to the wet season, you'll see that it jumps a little bit, and then the bottom falls out. We didn't know what to expect from Mother Nature at that time, just like we don't know what to expect from Mother Nature today. So you'll see, even when it reached the bottom of just under 9, it was followed by heavy rains, which brought it up to over 15, at which point we had to make discharges, east and west. So managing the lake at that point didn't necessarily spare discharges. If you look at the second oval on the right, you'll see the 2007-2008 droughts, where we came from 2006 down, leading into the wet season. You'll see it jumped up a little bit again, and then the bottom dropped out, and we got to the lowest recorded lake stage at about 8.82. It jumped up again a little bit, and then it dropped down again. We had back-to-back droughts. John, will you hit the next line? Thank you. So let me just kind of briefly go over what the district was doing at that time, and not just by ourselves, but with all of the agencies, to show what happens in that scenario. John, can you click? So in October 2006, you'll see that we had ridden the lake down. We thought we were starting the wet season in July. We didn't quite get it. It started to bump up, and then the bottom started to fall out. At 12.68, we were issuing water shortage emergency orders for Lake Istapoga and Indian Prairie. In November 2006, we were issuing water shortage orders, mandates, cutbacks within the Lake Okeechobee service area, which was about 15% to our 1 in 10 year irrigation. The water shortage warning was issued for the lower East Coast, and we started a public messaging campaign looking at folks to reduce water use. In December of 2006, the district had to go and purchase 14 temporary pumps for emergency use at Lake Okeechobee. We had to have these made specially so that they could be retrofitted and fit on the structures that were currently there. The district ordered another water shortage order for deliveries, as well as impacts to the Seminole Tribe Brighton Reservation, and then continued environmental deliveries to the Caloosahatchee. In January of 2007, again, we kicked it up a notch. Extensive public outreach to conserve water. We set weekly allocations and delivered only those amounts to users. And we had to start working with utilities, nursery growers, and landscape associations so that they could understand the severity of where we were going. Next slide. In February 2007, we had public workshops for marinas and business owners around the lake, because as you can see there in the picture, there was no more water to navigate. We coordinated with navigation lock restrictions with the Army Corps of Engineers, and we continued to coordinate with water user groups, and again, extensive public messaging. The district issued emergency orders. Those emergency orders had over 300 staff members assigned to deal with the priorities across the southern region. John? And so those were the teams that we had in place while we were trying to deal with those issues back in March 2007. So we keep going further along the schedule. In March 2007, the district water shortage order for the St. Lucie agricultural area, C23, C24, and C25 basins. 30% cutbacks on irrigation in Lake Okeechobee service area, 3-day-a-week watering and other restrictions in the lower East Coast. The temporary pumps were installed at those 3 sites I mentioned before, and we were making deviation requests to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers so that we could change the regulation schedules for the conservation areas in Lake Istapoga because we were running out of water. In April of 2007, again, ongoing outreach to Lake Okeechobee service area on increased cutbacks. Water withdrawals from the water conservation areas and regional canals by the districts and other entities that relied on that were terminated. We identified utilities at risk and utilities of concern and made sure we worked closely with them so they could understand where we could potentially end up in the future. And we initiated weekly monitoring of pumpage, water levels, and chlorides at our coastal utilities. We had additional emergency orders. The lower East Coast and the lower West Coast went to 2 days a week when they were looking at watering. The upper East Coast, 3 days a week. Istapoga and Indian Prairie Basins operational water delivery plan was put in place. We had a citizen information line that had over 23,000 calls. We started aggressive enforcement. This meant working with not only the counties and the state and the towns, but also involving local law enforcement. Or as folks like to talk about it, it was the shotgun on the levee approach. That's how serious folks take water down here. In May 2007, we had additional emergency orders. Restrictions in Palm Beach, Broward, 2 days a week in Miami-Dade and Florida Keys, and water restrictions in St. Lucie and Martin counties. An emergency order to deliver water 20 miles from an existing reservoir to West Palm Beach, which is not their source of water supply. Their source is rainwater, and the backup was Lake Okeechobee. And then 1 day a week watering in West Palm Beach. Again, in May, the utilities at risk, and you can see the lines there on the maps, that's the saltwater front. Basically underground, you've got a freshwater lens and a saltwater lens. That saltwater lens was at risk to move. Once that saltwater lens moves too far to the west, you lose your well fields. When you lose your well fields, you start implementing very costly solutions such as reverse osmosis. And you have to rely on well fields to the west to provide that additional water to public utilities, which means you continue to pull that saltwater front west. So we had them reduce or shift pumpage, and then we were monitoring for the impacts of that salt water on a weekly basis. Then we hit our record low lake level at 8.82. All in all, we had strong cooperation from folks. Everybody realized that we were all in it together, but it wasn't without the help of our local law enforcement, the counties, the towns, the state, and the federal government in trying to address the issue that we were facing. You can see there just some of the stats. We had over $400,000 in civil penalties. And it's okay that you moved, John, but the one thing I want to say last on that slide is, and that was just going into that dip. Remember, we jumped back up, and then we went back down. So what are the consequences of lowering the lake to levels of 9 feet by the end of the dry season? Well, you can't get there with the infrastructure that we have in place today. So what do we have to do? We have to send more water west and more water east, which means we've got to send significant amounts during the times where when you don't receive it, and more frequently. And again, for the folks out there, because I know I heard some commotion after that, sending it south with the infrastructure we have in place, we can do as much as we can, but it's not the way we get it done without that infrastructure. We need the additional infrastructure. We need the additional projects that we're talking about. I'll talk about that in a moment, so that we have the ability to do that. That's where we rely on our federal and state partners to make sure that we can get the funding and put these in the ground. Limiting releases to the St. Lucie estuary would mean that it'd be at the expense of the Caloosahatchee. Double the volume of highly damaging discharges would need to go there in order to do it. Impacts to water supply for both the Lake Okeechobee and the lower East Coast would also be part of driving that down. And it'd be detrimental to the ecology, not that it isn't now in the scenario that we're under, but even more so to the ecology of the Caloosahatchee and to the lake. There's a high level of risk to all users when forcing the lake to a level of 9 feet in the dry season. There's no guarantee that when the wet season rains will begin or where the rain will fall, which can result in a drought similar to 2007. Impacts of a drought under these management levels is highly likely to cause Lake Okeechobee to drop to 7 feet or lower, which means we're not able to send any water. And it results in no availability for all users, including the environment. Just a few, and I know everybody's not in the room, so I'll read these off quickly. Impacts from persistent low Lake Okeechobee stages from managing the lake consistently lower means major and long-term impacts to fish and wildlife, major losses to fisheries and associated economy around the lake, in-lake pump stations dry and inoperable, no longer moving water out of the lake. District is unable to deliver the Seminole Tribe of Florida its allotted water entitlement at both the Big Cypress and Brighton reservations. Extreme and critical cutbacks to the south and the southeastern coastal municipalities, harming businesses and residents from Palm Beach County to the Florida Keys. Strong potential for saltwater intrusion in urban and coastal areas, diminishing fresh water supply in well fields and water to fight fires, affecting public health and safety. The stormwater treatment areas would no longer receive water to maintain functionality, resulting in damaging increases in nutrients to the Everglades and billions of dollars of investment lost. With no backup water supply from the lake, the Everglades and the water conservation areas are at high risk for muck fires, permanently destroying Everglades habitat and threatening human life. And the Caloosahatchee River is no longer navigable from Lake Okeechobee. No access. So this is what I really want to focus on today. I don't want to talk about the history. I don't want to talk about the parade of horribles that happened under all the situations. I want to talk about where we need to go and what we need from everybody in this room and outside this room as far as support. We need to look at continued support and funding for short-term solutions. We need to look at dispersed water management projects, both public and private. We need to look at estuary protection wells. We need to look at temporary pumps like we're doing now. We need to look at temporary deviations like we're doing now with the Corps of Engineers. We need to look at the Herbert Hoover dike rehabilitation, which we now have full funding for. we need to look at revising the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, which is what the Colonel was pointing to before. And we have the C-43 reservoir under construction and the C-44 reservoir and STA under construction, and we expect to have them operable within the next couple of years. Long term, you can go back, John. Long term, we need to look at Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project. We're planning that now. We have a draft, and we're moving that one forward to hopefully make it available for WRDA 2020. Looking at both above-ground storage as well as aquifer storage and recovery. We need to look at the SERP EAA reservoir and the SERP packer. We delivered that to Congress. The district spent 9 months working on it. The Corps turned it around faster than anything I've ever seen the Corps turn around, sir. And we delivered that to Congress, and we're waiting for that to be authorized. The SERP C-23, C-24 North and South Reservoir and STA. And then Northern Everglades. Everybody forgets about Northern Everglades, but the state approved that plan back in 2007. It has significant storage and treatment included in it, and it's something that we need to continue to focus on. And I continue to try to bring awareness to you. But when you look at those projects there, when you look at just the authorized projects we have in place, and this is where I'm sorry for the folks outside, hopefully you'll get to go back and look at this PowerPoint, but you'll see both the Caloosahatchee estuary on the top, the St. Lucie estuary on the bottom, the light blue. So over the 40-year period of record, we took the years with discharge and we plotted them out. The light blue is where we are today. The dark blue is where we'll be when all the authorized projects are in place. That's a significant reduction. The Caloosahatchee will have reductions of 70% over where we are today. The St. Lucie will have reductions of 80% over where we are today. That's where we need the energy. That's where we need the focus. And I look forward to making sure that we get there and looking for y'all to help us get there. John?
So as Ernie and I wrap up, Congressman, the next important step for many of the public here is to be part of what we'll soon announce specific dates in the winter for the public scoping of the revision of this battle book, informed by everything we just talked about, informed by your elected officials, by the passion that you send to us, whether it's the emails or whatever other forum. But we'll have folks come together, just like we did in 5, 6, and 7, and start the very hard work to revise this document. The other thing that was worth reiterating, and what we were standing on the dike and with the Mayor of Clewiston and Congressman Rooney on Wednesday, is we, as Ernie said, now have full funding for Herbert Hoover dike construction, which we appreciate that Congress passed the hurricane supplemental in February. It's from that hurricane supplemental that we, in fact, have the funding to finish Herbert Hoover dike rehab, not in 25, but in 2022. So at the same time, kind of obviously, we move the effort to do the Lohr's restudy sooner. And for anyone that wonders in the room or not, why not sooner? The physics of getting the contract workforce and the labor to put together the project, and we've walked you through the details and we'll do it again. You cannot bring this additional, at this point, over $800 million of work any faster physically than 2022. And I've personally been on the phone with CEOs of our contractors working through their timelines and how they can be as fast as possible. If there was any way, I can assure you that we could get it done sooner, we would bring you that plan. So with that said, we appreciate the chance to talk this water management picture. I want to hand off to Mr. Cameron for a quick minute and the other agency partners that are vital in this effort. Sir.
Thank you very much, Colonel, and I appreciate the City of Stuart providing us the opportunity to use your facility today. I want to acknowledge that Congressman Mast is the reason we're here today. Back on July 25th, there was a meeting in Washington of the Everglades Task Force, and Congressman Mast was there, and he asked some very probing and knowledgeable questions that, quite frankly, the people who were in the room at the time couldn't answer. So at that point, we committed to come down here to Stuart and get the level of detail that you've just been provided, so those questions could be answered. I just want to observe that my boss, Secretary Zinke, understands the significance of a tourist economy, understands the significance of outdoor recreation. He grew up in a town that was really totally dependent on tourism, and the environmental quality of that community affected dramatically the economic activity in that community. So the Interior Department looks forward to continuing to work with the Congressman and the Corps to get this work done as fast as we possibly can. Our role essentially is to try to smooth out any regulatory speed bumps that might be in the way of progress, and to assist the Corps and the district with scientific information that might be helpful to more effectively manage the ecological impacts on the whole region of the very tough decisions that have to be made on a very regular basis in this part of the state. So with that, I think I'll hand the microphone back actually to my colleagues. All right.
Thank you. I'm Larry Williams with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Congressman, thank you for getting us all together, and the City of Stuart, thank you for hosting us. I really appreciate everybody being here today. The primary interest the Fish and Wildlife Service has is in threatened and endangered species, and in this area it's especially an interest in manatees. And Congressman, a little over a month ago you asked us to take a close look at the potential impacts of pollution on manatees here in the Indian River Lagoon. And we've done that. We got with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and a lot of other agencies to review all of the information that we have. And Congressman, the written report is on its way back to you. I can summarize it by saying that the strongest evidence we have of pollution affecting manatees is really in the form of the brown tide events, which are more frequent in the north part of the lagoon. That's a different form of algae from the blue-green algae, but the way it works is the brown tide events happen and they shade out the seagrasses. Manatees normally feed on the seagrasses. When the seagrass is gone, the manatees start to eat seaweed, and the seaweed has a lower nutritional value, and it basically causes physiological changes in the animals that they eventually die from. So there's been about 190 manatees that have died in the lagoon since 2012, and many of those have been, their stomachs were filled with this seaweed. So seems to be some cause and effect relationship there. And we'll continue to work with the other agencies and in close coordination with your office, Congressman, to recommend ways that could be improved. Most of those brown tide events are associated with local runoff that's typically coming from septic systems and fertilizers, those sorts of things. So we do have a handle on how that cause and effect relationship is happening, and glad to work with the agencies and the public in trying to address that. Thank you.
Congressman, thanks for Drew Bartlett, Deputy Secretary, Department of Environmental Protection. Thanks for having us here. Absolutely, these discharges are devastating. You know, the algae blooms we're having, the fish kills we're having, they're devastating, and they're devastating the economy on the east and west coast, and action has to happen. Absolutely. And we need to clean the water. We need to reduce the discharge. We need to put the water where it needs to go and clean it as it goes there. So at the state, we are absolutely pushing these projects forward. Just this week, or this month, the Water Management District did the final contract to put a large stormwater treatment area north of the lake to clean the water going into the lake. They're executing a contract on a public-private partnership called Brighton Valley to clean the water before it goes in the lake. The Corps is about finished with Kissimmee River restoration, cleaner water going in the lake. It is very important that we clean this water, and very important that we send it south. So Governor Scott last Friday asked the district to go ahead and work with research institutions, universities, other state agencies to look for opportunities while the Corps is looking at lures to move more water south, because that's what needs to happen. We will be tracking the Senate. I know, Congressman, when I went to your office and I saw the battle plan on your whiteboard, it just was an amazing, and it felt great to all the stakeholders in that room that you are fighting so hard to get these projects going forward. So we're with you. Please, please let us know everything we can do to help get this WRDA 2018 passed, to get the funding where I know you want it to be, so that we can get these projects going. So please, at the end of this, we'll review everything and make sure we're getting that job done. Thank you, Congressman.
I want to thank everybody for taking the time to come here into our neighborhood. I am glad of all of the testimonies that I heard, all of the statements that I heard, because I believe the statements that I heard really lead into the points that I think need to be so heavily considered for our community. Our community, it was said, our community is getting decimated here. This didn't just happen this year. This happens year after year. There are communities on the West Coast that are getting decimated. It didn't just happen this year. It does happen year after year. This is something that is preventable. And I don't like to try to make this a combative situation, but Mr. Marks, when you put up a board on a slide on the screen that says people have to go to 3 days a week of watering their lawn, that's something that falls on deaf ears here when you're talking about our entire waterway being destroyed. That's not an apples to apples comparison of people having to make sacrifices. Colonel Kirk, may I borrow your book? Not your Lore's book, this one. Colonel, you held up this book about the hurricane. You held it up on the West Coast, I believe on Wednesday or Tuesday, earlier this week. And you just said, you pounded on your Lore's book. You said, your number one mission is integrity of the Herbert Hoover dike. That is your number one mission. Every one of us in here, I'm assuming, has done first grade math. And the first grade math is that every inch of water off Lake Okeechobee means less risk to that integrity of the dike around Lake Okeechobee. We are asking that you fulfill your mission of putting less risk to that dike, because when it gets to the point of what we're at right now, when we say there was high rain that we couldn't anticipate, we're not telling anybody something they couldn't anticipate, that we can't predict the weather. We all acknowledge that. But to let it get to the point that it is an emergency on the dike, which means mission failure of protecting the integrity of the dike, to let it get to that point, and we have to send it out to estuary, to our estuary, the other estuary, that cannot be the option. It can't be the way going forward every single year for our community. This is where I'm presenting to you my ask. I heard, and I think everybody else in here heard, all of the points that you're making about what happens with low water levels. There are consequences, but there are consequences to high water levels, and what happens in our community as well. That knife does absolutely cut both ways. I want to get my guy Brad ready to tee something up for me here, because this is a conversation that we had in Washington, D.C., and I did ask very pointed questions, and to your point, there were answers given. It wasn't that the answers were ill-prepared. I believe it's that the answers were the truth. I believe that this is a place that we can work together to say maybe we can't do everything, but we can absolutely increase these chances greatly that come next May 15, when we hit the wet season, we're that much further ahead that we don't have to worry about it becoming an emergency situation for the dike where our estuaries have to be blown out. Brad, if you could start with that video number 1 for me, I would appreciate it. Those entities that you're talking about. Those entities that you're talking about, would you send them water that they need for all of those things if Lake Okeechobee is at 12 feet?
Sir, I think to answer your question, if it's necessary to sustain the populations of South Florida, the people that we rely on for our economy, the people that we rely on and that enjoy the natural resources we have, that sending that water to ensure that we can maintain those populations is something that is a priority of our district and is authority given to us under law. So yes, we would send that water to the south.
Would you send the water if the lake was at 11 feet?
Sir, I think under any circumstance where you're going to ask if we go down the numbers, we're going to continue to focus the priority on human health and safety, which includes providing water for the populations that live in South Florida.
It does not include human health and safety in my community that's getting discharges of microcystin algae and cyanobacteria. But I am going to continue to ask these questions because I absolutely want it on the record. So would it happen if the lake was at 9 feet?
Sir, I think the answer is the same that I gave you before.
And 8 feet?
The same, sir.
So my ask is that you work with us. Let us all work together to say, if everybody can be made whole, what you said in that statement in Washington at this Everglades Restoration Task Force meeting, if everybody can be made whole, then let's work in those dry months, November, December, January, February, March, to get water to entities that are asking for water when they need the water. It was already stated by Colonel Kirk that water wasn't sent when other municipalities were asking for it. Let's send that water where it can be sent. Let's send that water down those other canals, down into Hillsborough, down into Miami, down into these other canals where there is opportunity to send water. This cannot be something that we be ill prepared for as we move into the wet season, to where it becomes an emergency being mission failure. It's mission failure if we get to the point that we have to worry about there's a storm on the horizon, and if we don't send that water, the dike could fail, 36,000 people south of Lake Okeechobee could die. This is about mission accomplishment. I want you to accomplish that mission, but it can't be the choice to send the water to our tides in order to accomplish that mission because of failed preparation. Now, in that, I have a number of folks that are going to speak to how this is affecting our community. I would first like to welcome up Mr. Robert Lord. Mr. Robert Lord, please give us a couple minutes of your remarks. After that, we will go to Mr. Blair Wickstrom. After that, we will go to Sanibel City Mayor Kevin Ruin. After that, Mr. Mark Perry. And after that, Dr. Gary Goforth. And please give us your remarks. Thank you.
We're going to give you the microphone. Give me a microphone. Somebody knows me well here. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer. That's quite all right. That is not a problem for me. A lot more people know me. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of Martin Health System. We operate 3 hospitals, employ about 4,500 people, and are, we believe, the premier healthcare provider on the Treasure Coast, serving Martin and St. Lucie County. Over the past several years, with the discharges and the algae blooms emanating from Lake Okeechobee, we've seen an increase in bacteria and toxins associated with blue-green algae. Our emergency departments have come in contact with a good number of patients who have presented with a variety of symptoms: nausea, vomiting, skin rashes, coughing, shortness of breath, gout, achy limbs, joints, that we have connected with contact with the river. We try to heal our patients. We are not a scientific research organization. I'm not going to present you with a double-blinded study here today. That's not what we do. We're a community hospital system. We take care of our patients and try and get them home as quickly as we can. But today our 4 emergency rooms are on heightened awareness. 2 years ago, we developed this signage, and I can share that with the audience. And it is querying patients about whether or not they've come in contact. To please let us know. It's not unlike what we did with Ebola not too long ago. We've implemented screenings, and the information that I have to share with you is that we've had all these symptoms that I reported to you. We're reporting data. We are gathering data. We're working with the health department to report the data. This year is not as significant as it was a couple of years ago on this coast. The West Coast seems to be suffering more, I feel, for our friends over there. 2 years ago, we had far worse problems. But this year, 73 patients in our emergency department
have been treated for symptoms that we believe were related to blue-green algae. Our physician offices have seen far more, less severe. The most severe patients come to the emergency room or are sent there. They fall into three basic categories: dermatologic, rashes and itches; respiratory problems; gastrointestinal being the third; nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea; the balance, severe headaches, burning in the eyes, significant non-abdominal pain. Now, again, I don't have the scientific proof that they are connected, but there's certainly a connection. These people were in contact with the river and then came to us, and they ascribed quite often this to their contact with the river. Here's what we know. We know that toxins and cyanobacteria, which is the blue-green algae, can be absorbed into your bloodstream, and that can cause internal problems. We know that the hydrogen sulfide, which I understand is the content in that algae that gives it the rotten egg smell, irritates eyes, nose, throat, makes it hard to breathe, particularly for people with asthma. We know that the exposure to hydrogen sulfide also causes headaches, memory problems, tiredness, balance problems. We know that exposure to these toxins in certain individuals makes them at much higher risk for secondary complications. Some of the most serious things we have seen are people with cancer, diabetes, liver or kidney conditions, COPD, weakened immune systems for some reason. Those people who have exposures are particularly at risk. We do not know the long-term effects of being exposed to these toxins. We do not know the effects of eating fish that are coming from these reservoirs. I'm an avid fisherman. I'm not eating any fish, folks. We don't know. What we witnessed 2 years ago was this bacteria, when it dies, seemingly seeping to the bottom of our river, and because of the lack of water flow in these rivers that were enough to rinse that out, there's a muck that forms on the bottom of that river. I used to wade a lot as a fisherman. I'd step in that muck. And the thought that these toxins are in that muck and stay forever is a very, very frightening thing to me. The medical and scientific communities have a lot to learn about the long-term impact. But if we are intellectually honest with ourselves, we know that the long-term impact is not going to be good. And common sense suggests to me that it could be very bad. I hate to think what the future will bring for our children or my grandchildren if we don't tackle this environmental issue now. The time to act is now. I'm glad to hear that there is a plan. I am not qualified or smart enough to speak about what the answer to this problem is, but I can tell you it is a serious public health issue in our community, and I believe that our friends on the West Coast agree it is a serious health issue over there, and I thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Hi, I'm Blair Wickstrom, publisher of Florida Sportsman Magazine. I appreciate all of you coming here today for what we're here for. Unfortunately, I hate to start with a football analogy, but I feel like Colonel and Ernie, you guys are like the ownership of a football program, and you're trying to explain why we should be happy about a 50-year losing streak, because that's what we're dealing with right now. And to hear what you guys are saying sounds like we're doing the right thing. But this is 50 years that we've been dealing with this, so it's not something that just has happened. I think in terms of human health for you guys, we've got a situation that's bigger than Flint. It's more deadly than Flint. I think Flint made national news, but this is more deadly. Cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, is linked to neurological deadly diseases. I mean, just like Rob Lord said, the doctor said, this is bad. This is bad. This is worse than Flint. Congressman, we know what we need to do. You know what we need to do. We need to get behind you. You need to tell the Corps to prioritize health and safety. You know that Congress can do it. That's what we need to do, and this is larger than just an ecological health issue. This is an economic issue, just as you stated. We know that this is impacting the financial well-being of our state. I work for a fishing and outdoor magazine. People aren't coming to Florida to go to sugarcane fields. They're coming here for the water. They're coming here to fish. Fishing is the number one activity in the state of Florida. Bar none. It's the number one activity. How do we not prioritize that? The economic impacts of what we're experiencing and seeing on the West Coast this year, you guys are seeing it like we saw in 16. I filmed a TV show with a captain, a local captain on the West Coast. I called him last night. I said, Chris, what's going on? And he said, I've lost $25,000 in business the last 2.5 months. A friend of his had to sell his truck to make his mortgage payment. Where we stayed when we were filming that show, Buchan's Landing, is their bookings are off 60%, and you're probably going to hear that from other testimony, but 60% this year. This is a big deal. It's clear. This is without a doubt. I think it goes without saying that we have to do something. And another year added to the 50 is not going to be acceptable. Congressman, I want to appreciate you for asking the right questions, but more importantly, for doing and showing us what true leadership means. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Kevin Rain for the record, Mayor of Sanibel. I'm also the representative for the West Coast for the South Florida Ecosystem Task Force. I appreciate everything that was put up on that board, but it was prior to Laws 2008. I'm only really in office for 12 years. I'm not aware of, with the exception of 1 year, where we actually had a water supply shortage, where we actually had stage 1, 2, or 3 in those 8 years. I begged year after year, this year specifically, 89 days of MFL violations. Okay? This isn't tourism. This is jobs. Our jobs are very important. We have tourism, we have real estate, and trickle down. And honestly, when we're coming to it, it's bigger than any other job creation right now. In 2016, we did work with the East Coast. We put together a coalition of mayors. There were 16 counties, 163 cities. You know the combined real estate values were $1.3 trillion? Tourism is $700 million. We are on the verge of collapsing an economy. 16, 17, 18 to where we are. And honestly, what we're doing isn't getting it done. Dispersed water management, we understand the situation we're in. We understand the lake is rising. But when we don't send it east and west, we need to do a better job. And unfortunately, when people come to me, they don't tell me I did a good job. I need to do a better job. We need to move water south. We need to store it, disperse water management. There's no situation. You're going to call me up next week. You're going to blow out the estuaries, and my economy is going to collapse. That's what's going to happen. And I have to deal with that. So instead of using money to pay unemployment claims and all the necessary SBA loans, let's truly think together. Work not just like we do during tragedies like this. Work together. Honestly, because I've looked at this situation, and every single year, we're the West Coast. Okay, I'm the spoiled child. I need water during the dry season. I don't want water during the wet season. I got it. But what we're doing is devastating. You want to talk about impacts? 620,000 pounds of my cities, we've actually removed fish. 310 tons of fish alone in that. I went up to the governor, asked for money. I don't want to deal with the symptoms. I want to create the causes. I want to actually solve the situation. I'm every much for every project that's up there. But the project's not going to be built quick enough. It's not going to be there. What are we going to do in the meantime? 19, 20? People are never going to come back here. And honestly, it's a situation I'm glad the congressman brought up. I've asked on the record 14, 13, 16, 17. I've asked to lower the lake. And would that have solved this situation? No. Would it have helped? Absolutely. I get an email that we sent 300 CFS. While I appreciate the fact that we've moved water south, we certainly know that a couple inches off the lake was more than that. So I look at this situation, and I applaud what you've done, Congressman. I've been asking for this. We're working together as East and West Coast people. Okay? That's what we are. Our jobs matter, too. They truly do. And honestly, my concern is that I'm not going to have an economy to live with. Thank you.
I'm Mark Perry, Executive Director of Florida Oceanographic. Thank you, Congressman, for convening this. Those of us who've been around, I was asked by the new colonel, I says, how long I've been around, and it's decades. And in fact, I moved here, I grew up here since 1957. And it was a lot different back then. And when I went away to college, merchant marine, became a scientist, came back, I said, the water here is really getting worse and worse. We convened the first ever in 1978, the Estuary Conference, where we brought together the Corps of Engineers, the district, all the jurisdictions around this estuary. This estuary is important to me personally, but it's important to people who have come to this area, just like I did and grew up in this area, and are continuing to grow up in this area. It provides us with a tremendous diversity of marine life that's attracted so many people and so many economies that are surrounding it. And as you know, and you've heard me talk about the discharges and all the runoff that's coming into this estuary, and the discharges have devastated the population. You go out right outside here now and you see the oyster reefs that are exposed. And before the meeting, when I walked in here, I looked at those. There was hardly a living oyster that usually spits a little bit of spat when they're exposed. There was nothing left out here. There are the shells and the remnants of that, but we've been over 90 days with freshwater conditions in an estuary, and adult oysters can only tolerate 20 days. So we've pretty much wiped that out. You go out of the outer estuary, the seagrass beds, which we've talked about, seagrass communities right inside the St. Lucie Inlet, over 435 acres. They used to be lush and thick right up to 2013, and you compare those aerial photos now, and you got sandbars out there. Devastated completely. We've lost about 400 acres of viable seagrass community that supports fish and juveniles and a lot of different things that happen. Over 300 species just for oyster reefs alone are supported. We're losing a lot of that year after year. Every time we get these discharges, we're losing that. And it's a tremendous loss, not only for these estuaries and the community, but now you bring toxic algae, which comes in since 2004. Prior to that, I never saw that coming in. But when those algae blooms happen in the lake and those discharges come in, that freshwater condition sustains that freshwater algae as long as that bloom is in here. And it's fed by the nutrients and all the runoff that's coming in. And that's really a problem because it's a toxic algae, just as the doctor described. It's a human health issue. Are we in favor of fixing the dike? Absolutely. The dike is a safety issue, and it's been going on for a long time. Those of us that know that when it was built in 1930 to 1937 and completed, it was in response to major hurricane events that you held up there before. And then the Congress passed, the 80th Congress, the Rivers and Harbor Act was amended. In 1948, the July 1930 amendment was amended to include the Central and South Florida Flood Control Project. And that's the colonel's holding up that book. That's the LOR schedule. And that's the schedule we go by when we look at where the lake is, how much we have to discharge to the estuaries. It also has a Part C in that schedule, which says how much do we send south to the water conservation areas. And the end of that decision tree is always the maximum extent practicable. And that really bugs me, and it also bugs people on the West Coast, because we have specific cubic feet per second limits that would discharge east and west. The maximum extent practicable is how much water is in those water conservation areas, how much water is in the Everglades. And when the EAA basin runoff is allowed to discharge that like they did in May and jump that up 1.5 feet above their schedules in the Everglades and water conservation areas, there's no capacity to put that water south. And we need that capacity for the state water, for the Okeechobee, Lake Okeechobee water to flow south. We need to attenuate that flow to the north. Absolutely. The Lake Okeechobee Watershed Project is not going to be enough, but we need a bigger, major project to contain and attenuate what used to take 6 or 8 months now takes 2 days to get that water into the lake. comes in too fast, too much at too long, and now it's got nowhere to go south because those outlets south are very, very small compared to the outlets east and west. And they're very constrained to the capacity. Will the EA reservoir help us? It might. It'll help us some, but it's not going to be enough either. We need more to help move that water south. And in fact, you know, this problem's not been going on for a long time. I say back in 1930, thank you, the Martin County put up this resolution, December 15th, 1930. There was a county commission here in Martin County. They passed a resolution to go to the Internal Improvement Trust Fund and said, basically, close the gates to Lake Okeechobee and end the St. Lucie Canal, because the reason is that they're causing discharge of large volumes of dirty water into the St. Lucie River, has killed all the shellfish and driven all the saltwater fish from the river and filled the river with hyacinths and polluted water into the St. Lucie River. This is 1930, so it's not a new issue. It's not something we need to go. And back in 1958, the Corps even put out a report that a third outlet south of the lake is needed in order to put that water south. Can we have a lower schedule in Lours? I believe we can. I can believe we can modify Lours. There are water shortage lines that are at the bottom, but yet those water shortage lines, and we don't want to jeopardize the lake's health either. So the minimum flow and level for the lake can be met, and I believe we can keep the lake lower so that when we get a tropical storm and the schedule jumps up or the lake jumps up 3.5 to 4 feet, we'll be more prepared at a lower lake level. So I appreciate your time, and I'll be available any time for any more information. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Gary Goforth. Congressman, thank you very much for assembling this group. Colonel, thank you very much for exercising your flexibility in your battle plan. Mr. Marks as well, thank you for your flexibility. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Department here, thank you for coming down here. Your presence has been conspicuously absent, so we now are happy to see you here. The Indian River Lagoon has over 33 endangered and threatened species. It's not just the manatee. So please, one recommendation would be an after-action report to look at not only the water, because it's not just the water. Over the last 5 years, the federal government has dumped over 2 trillion gallons of polluted Lake Okeechobee water to the St. Lucie River, Caloosahatchee, and the Lake Worth Lagoon. Over 2 million pounds of phosphorus, over 25 million pounds of nitrogen, and most alarming in many cases is the algae, but also over 400 million pounds of suspended sediment. In 1914, the story from Ernie Lyons is you could take your rowboat to where the Roosevelt Bridge is today and look down 14 feet and see the clear water, through the clear water, see the sandy bottom. We don't talk enough about the muck, but it's more than just the water. The state of Florida has failed its citizens with respect to protecting the water quality, protecting the public health of these rivers and Lake Okeechobee. The source of this algae, let's make no mistake, is a very polluted Lake Okeechobee, and that, I think, is due in large part on the failure of the state of Florida to enforce water quality standards and to actually reduce the pollution loading going into Lake Okeechobee. Let's talk about a success story, and Congressman Mast, you're right on point. The Corps and the district needs additional flexibility at both the low end and the upper end of Lours. In 2013, there were massive discharges to this estuary. We went down and met with the Water Management District. We did our own after-action report. We noticed, as Mark mentioned, many times Lours would say to the Water Management District to send releases south to the maximum extent practicable. We reviewed and noted that there were several weeks that the Water Management District failed to do that. So additional oversight to ensure that maximum extent practicable is actually achieved, I think would be very helpful. At the same time, we were asking for these additional releases during the dry season, and that is absolutely critical because that's the perfect opportunity to send water south when the STAs have capacity to treat the water, when the Everglades has capacity to receive that water. we were telling the governing board of the Water Management District, send more water south, and their response was to draw up a full PowerPoint presentation on the constraints. And some of them I think are very valid. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has numerous constraints on sending water south, even sending water into the stormwater treatment areas. So to the extent you can remove those constraints, that would be helpful. As we were being told that no more water could be sent south, fortunately the staff of the Water Management District sent historic over 130 billion gallons of water south. And basically it turned out to be the most productive year for the stormwater treatment areas in their treatment capacity. They had the highest performance ever up to that date. Since that time, the Water Management District gratefully has added another 60,000 acre-feet of storage to the EAA flow equalization basin. And so now, today, more than ever, there is sufficient capability to send that water south. Again, Congressman, thank you very much. The Colonel, thank you very much. Colonel Kelly, welcome.
I thank you for listening to everybody's comments. I thank you for making all the comments. They're very, very important. And this is the crux of what I hope we can talk about. Can we help the Corps accomplish their mission of dike integrity? Can we help meet all of those needs that you're managing, Mr. Marks, with South Florida Water Management District? And can we help out the East and West Coast communities by not sending this water to tide, or not reaching that emergency situation where we have to send water to tide, by lowering these lake levels, not to our areas, let me add, not to our areas, during those dry months, November, December, January, February, March, April, before we get to that May 15th point, like this year. May 15th, we hit it, and we were at about 12 foot 10 inches on Lake Okeechobee. Can we work to get to a point where, if it were the same situation next year, instead of being at 12-10, we're down at 11, or we're down at 10? Can you work with us to help in those dry months, to show us that you've done everything you can to make that lake as low as reasonably possible during those months, so that we are the last button that has to be pushed and it doesn't reach this emergency situation? That is my ask. I hope we can work together on this. It matters at every single level of our communities, as you've heard from everybody. And in that, I hopefully look forward to simply hearing a yes, but if I don't, then we can discuss that as well.
So what I'll respond with is, yes, we will work to review that fundamental question. Whether or not we can have a planned deviation to do something next year, I'm not prepared to say within the boundaries of this document. But without a doubt, and Mr. Wickstrom, Mayor Ruane, Mark, Mr. Lord, your comments are exactly the sort of detailed, specific comments that drive us one way or the other in this revision. This was a publicly hard fought, is probably the right word, developed document. We need to take the tensions, the passions that we have this year and the last several years into this discussion. So at the end of the day, as I want to hand off to Director Marks, what we have here, and I hope, I took a class a few years ago on the Harvard negotiation program, and the fundamental learning point in this class that was about a civil war that almost happened between Peru and Ecuador is, initially, in the first weeks leading up to this almost civil war, the two presidents of Peru and Ecuador kept looking at each other at loggerheads. And then at a certain point, in the pictures they show on week 3, is they were both essentially sitting, as you and I are now, looking at a common problem, or a common problem which is a constrained battle book. And we together are looking at this, together trying to figure it out. And so the Army Corps and this whole group need to be looking at the problem, which is a constrained system, and doing everything possible. And I just assure you, from the 850 folks that work directly for me, we are doing that day in, day out to figure out how to better operate this system. Some of it takes time. But the fact that we've got literally over $500 million now in our coffers because of the work of you and your colleagues, that is significant. And it's not necessarily enough for next week, but it's significant, and I think we need to put it to good use. So where I'll end is, my solemn effort is to have the public that our civil servants serve trust what we're doing, and have the taxpayers of Illinois and everywhere else trust that this is a correct investment of taxpayer funds. And so we will continue. My point is this federal effort with the state effort, we are putting everything we have into it. And I've told you that from day one. And so, we will take your inputs today and continue to work to find other options and better options. Thanks.
Congressman, thank you. So you led into your statement saying that you didn't want this to be combative. It's not combative for what you and I want to see, which is the balancing of the needs in the communities across South Florida and here. And here. What is combative is trying to balance all those needs over South Florida. And I look forward to your help and the help of the other representatives and communities and state and federal leaders so that we can make that happen as quickly as possible and balance all those needs. So the answer is yes. I want to work with you, as well as every other community in South Florida, to make sure we balance the needs. Mr. Wickstrom, I just wanted to say to you, my presentation, I talked about the history. And I started it by saying we inherited something that now serves way more people than I was ever expected to do. So my focus, and what I tried to point to at the end of the presentation, was I'm not focused on the past. I'm focused on what we can do now. And so I hope to work with you and everyone else here and all the other communities to get that done.
One thing in reference to the past, when you're going through the drought and you're going through what we were doing to treat it, I didn't see anything in terms of what the EAA or Sugar was asked to give up or how
So I appreciate the comment, and the response is we have to balance everything across all the southern counties. And it's not going to be easy. And for people who want to see changes to stuff like that, we need your voices at the table. Mr. Perry, before you mentioned everything that we're doing, and you talked about the lake and what needs to happen north of the lake, and I wholeheartedly agree. We had a plan that was passed by the state legislature in 2007 that focused on storage and treatment north of the lake, and we need to put our focus back on that plan. And Gary, I appreciate your comments. I really do, the ones you made here today. And I know that sometimes we're at odds on stuff, but I do appreciate your insights and you coming up here and talking with us today. I know that there are times you say that we have the flexibility and we use it. There are times you say that we don't use the flexibility. But I appreciate those conversations because that's what makes us think. That's what makes us look at what we're doing. Because if we don't look at what we're doing, we get into a phase. We tend to blank out. And we just coast as we typically do. And I don't want to coast. I want to look at challenges. May not always be the answer you want, but I want to look at those challenges and see what we can do. And then finally, Congressman, folks in the audience, all I'd like to say is the Colonel laid out an antiquated plan that was supposed to be an interim schedule. That was supposed to be interim back in 2008. It's 2018. We need to get started now, as quickly as possible, to look for how we can take advantage of not just what's been done to date, what's going to be done over the next several years, and the projects that we're currently building and the ones that are going to come online in the future, so that we don't have to revisit schedule after schedule after schedule after schedule as we go forward, and we build in that flexibility now. So I think it's all about flexibility. It's all about the focus on that. And again, I look forward to working with you and other community leaders as we go through this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernie. Congressman, thank you so much, sir, for having this meeting. Madam Mayor, thank you for hosting this. As a Martin County resident, my children on the South Fork of the St. Lucie River every day on a crew team, my family having a home on the South Fork of the St. Lucie River, I certainly understand how all these people are affected in this community. One of the things that we haven't talked about here today, when Mr. Wickstrom talked about having a losing streak with a football team for 50 years, I've never seen an underfunded football team make it to the Super Bowl. And I think one of the big problems that we have here, and I mentioned this at our task force meeting, is that when we go back to the year 2000 with our 50-50 cost share program, where we, the state, and the federal government were supposed to be 50-50 partners. The federal government made a promise to the state government saying we're going to join in together 50-50, we're going to get these projects done based upon the integrated delivery schedule that's supposed to be completed by 2030. And as we sit here today, the federal government is almost $1 billion with a B dollars behind the state of Florida. And if we do not get this funding, I would ask President Trump to take decisive action. Congressman, I thank you for your passion, your dedication, your commitment. I would love to go camp out on the front lawn of the White House with you and say, President Trump, send us the money that we need, because as you know, sir, right now we're waiting for the Senate Majority Leader, Mr. McConnell, to bring WRDA, the Water Resources and Development Act, to a vote to the Senate floor. We're waiting now. You and Senator Rubio, Senator Nelson, everyone is writing letters saying bring this to a vote. But as you also know, that once that is approved, that is just simply an authorization. That is not funding for that project. And we know that there are projects that were authorized by Congress going back into the late 1990s in the Kissimmee Prairie Basin that are still not funded today. That is a concern to me as a governing board member. That is a concern to me as a taxpayer and a Martin County resident. So we need to be bringing all of our energy. Everybody in this room, everybody within the sound of my voice needs to be going to the federal government and saying you're $1 billion behind in this cost share. I'm a businessman. When I enter into a partnership with someone and I make a capital call, the first time that they don't pay their share of it, they probably lose the opportunity to make decisions. The second time I make a capital call and they don't pay it, they're out of the partnership. I find a new partner. I find a way to get it done on my own. I don't want to go that direction. We need the federal government. This is no reflection on Colonel Kirk or Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds or the fine people with the Corps of Engineers. They have been doing a fantastic job, but without money, they are frustrated. They can't get their part of the job done, nor can we. So let's get together. Let's stand together. Let's go to Washington and say, fund these projects now, because if we don't have the money, we're going to be sitting here till 2050 and beyond talking about let's get it done. And I'm 43 years old, and I'd like to see my grandchildren be able to enjoy a clean St. Lucie estuary. Thank you, sir.
So thank you. You know, a couple of remarks on this. As we talk about funding, when I was sat at the South Florida Water Management District meeting, I believe it was on the 16th, what was the date? Last week. When I sat there at the meeting last week, the chairman of the board, Mr. Fernandez, said three very important things. He said that not only are we limited in our funds, but he also said that we have to use every single tool in the toolbox. Those are the two most important things that he said there. And when he said use every tool in the toolbox, he didn't say except lowering lake levels during the dry season. And when we talk about these funds that are constrained, that's exactly why this has to be an option. When Mayor Wayne asks for water during the dry season and he's denied, and Lake Okeechobee could be at a lower level moving into the wet season, that is a mission failure right there. That's where we could have made his situation better on his coast. Lake Okeechobee could have been made lower, which accomplishes the LOR's mission, making sure that the threat to that dike doesn't occur, and it helps our community over here, saying that if they were getting the 1,000 CFS that they were requesting, and right now we're getting 1,300 CFS, then instead we could only be getting 300 CFS. That could be the difference in sending them the water when they ask for it and not sending them the water that they ask for. That's the difference. This is why it matters, because every dollar that South Florida Water Management District spends, every dollar that's spent in Washington, D.C. and Tallahassee, It's somebody's dollar out here. It comes out of their wallet. It comes out of their pockets. It's their fruits of their labor. And we're charged with being good stewards of that. And this is something that does not cost one penny. And that's where I want to ask again, Colonel on the other end, was it Kelly? Is that correct? Kelly, as you're incoming, what level are you willing to work with? We have everybody at the table right now. Let's not think about another time to meet. Let's not say we need to bring more people in. Let's not say we need to get all the players at the table. We got the players at the table. What level, moving out of this wet season and into the dry season, will you work with us on as a target to say, listen, you know what? For next, as we move out of next dry season, we're going to make it a goal that that lake is down at 11 feet because we sent all the water to the stormwater treatment areas, to the flood equalizations basins, to the L8, to this. We sent all the water that we could there during those months so that we are as far ahead of schedule moving into the wet months. So hopefully we don't have to push that button on the east and the west coast. Give me a level that you will work with me on. Mr. Marks, we played the video already. You were willing to talk to me about it before. And I want us to be on the same. I don't think it was a mistake. Maybe we can't hit every level there, but where can we work together on this to say, you know what, we can make that the target moving out of here. So we got an action plan coming in the future. Where can we work?
So, Congressman, I appreciate the question, and I think I did give an answer before. And it may not be the answer that everyone here wants to hear, but it's the answer that I can't take a narrow focus in my job representing all the 16 counties of South Florida. I need to balance all of the needs. And balancing those needs, which include the East Coast and Martin County, means having everybody at the table so that we can work through those issues. And so I told you 100%, the district is there at the table. We'll bring the science, we'll bring the communities, we'll work with the Corps, and we'll help everybody hopefully arrive at something that it may not be everything that everybody wants, but at least we'll all understand what everybody's needs and issues were when we developed it, and we come to some level of agreement.
So, Congressman, I echo Ernie's comments. What I showed you on the chart when I said our glide path on January 9th per LORS was to get to 12.5. That's what this public was a part of with the other public constituencies Ernie talked about that set 12.5 as our target. We cannot, and one of the things I'm taught is I can never be arbitrary and capricious. I can't just take that book and say, throw it off the table, let's just you and me decide on another one. We won't bother talking to Palm Beach. We won't bother talking to South Dade. Let's just you and three of us come up with a number. We can't do that. You wouldn't, I don't think, really ask me to do that. So right now, 12.5 is the operating range on the low end. We need to, and if we think we can aggressively do some deviations, we will, but I'm telling you, we've got to work through the process to get all the right voices to the table, to balance the needs, and we will dive into it with you.
There is a lot of, you outlined a great deal of flexibility with your slides. All of the flexibility that's executed during the wet season. You gave us slide after slide of how you're working. You told us about the 14 temporary pumps that you had to purchase. So great, they're already paid for in case we ever have to use them again because that water gets too low. We already own the pumps. So that's one of the things that we're a little bit ahead on that. The reality is, Mr. Marks, is as you talk about all of the other interests that you have to balance, that's true. You have a lot of other interests to balance, but just because somebody has some other interest, that doesn't mean that we can let everybody keep coming in here and basically peeing in our pool. That can't be the option, and that's the way that this is occurring here. That just can't be the relationship for us. And so it's in that I say, you have this flexibility. Tell us how you can execute that flexibility in that dry season. Tell us where you can, you know you have the flexibility. You gave slide after slide of it. Tell us how you can work with us on that.
Congressman, what I told you is we're going to do a deliberative LOR's revision process. That's how government works to serve multiple constituencies over multiple years. This is not a, you came into this job about, 20 months ago, all right? This challenge, and anyone out there, so we're going to respectfully talk about this issue for a few more minutes, and then we're going to close this out, and we will continue in other fora to talk this issue. We have to revise the LORs. That's the bottom line. I appreciate your pointed question from one specific constituency, but you understand that we cannot throw out a number and then just say, let's go with it. But what we assure you is there are always variables that go into that calculus. I showed you, and whether it's a battlefield of Iraq or Afghanistan that you and I have experience on, or it's South Florida, you make leadership decisions with the information you have at the time. On January 9th, I had a NOAA forecast of a drought. That informed that leader decision. On January 9th of 19, I'll have the information of what happened in the summer of 18. And Colonel Kelly will have what happened in the summer of 18. And he'll have the red tide he smelled on Wednesday, and that'll inform his leader decision. And just like I've done and Ernie have done, we'll talk to you twice a week, whatever we have to, so you understand our rationale for decision making. And we will fight together to get a better schedule with these fundamental projects done. And the last thing I'll say, I threw out an op-ed that some of you read in the last couple of days. And I talked about, in Patrick Smith's book, The Land Remembered, he talks about this travesty of the South Florida system, his words, not mine, but that was created with some of the limitations. And in that book, he says it's a travesty that will never be changed. And what kind of fires me up is we together are fighting hard to change what some people suggest could never be overturned. But we're fighting to do it and make Patrick Smith wrong. So let's keep doing that together into the years to come, and we will make it better.
Sir, I appreciate the conversation about LORs, and I will switch to that briefly. The LORs is a science-based schedule. And I think this is important to discuss as we move forward into LORs, is the idea of shared adversity based upon any kind of science.
I think that this is a balance of interest. So if you go back to that yellow slide, that yellow slide is what goes into it. And you see science, you see economics, you see health, you see a variety of requirements that, yes, the simple answer is yes, there's science in it.
Is it based upon science that we share pollution, toxins, in an area that has nothing to do with contributing to those toxins on the lake? And that was stated by South Florida Water Management District when I was there last week. The statement was given that our estuary here does nothing to contribute to the issues on Lake Okeechobee. That was a statement made by South Florida Water Management District. So it is not science to share adversity. That's something that occurred that, in my opinion, is political, and that has to be worked through in a very serious way as we go through this next LORS revision. And in that, I hope that you will take to heart what we discussed here. There is an option to not blow out our estuaries next year. There's an option there. To use your words, Mr. Tucker, you used the words in that meeting last week. You said there are two options. Either we send water to the boulder zone or we blow out the estuaries. But that's not the truth. There are more options. And the option is management in those dry months. Give Sanibel the water that they need. Send water to the STAs. Send water to the flow equalization basin. Send water to the canals so you get that water lower, so you don't do that option that you spoke of, which is blow out our estuary. I hope that you will all take this to heart, work on this. I hope that you will come back to me with a number that you're willing to work with me on for this, and I'll give you your microphone back.
Congressman, I think we're at the point where we started, which is thank you for convening this important meeting. At this point, Mr. Cameron, we came here at the request of Ms. Combs, a leader in DOI. Do you have anything else to close out with from Washington perspective?
So, very briefly, I know that Larry from the Fish and Wildlife Service has been in South Florida for quite a few decades. It may have been a while since you've seen someone from the Secretary's office here in Stuart, but I'll tell you, I'm glad to have been here today. I've learned a lot today. I'll be bringing a message of what I've learned back to Secretary Zinke and my boss, Susan Combs. Clearly, there's a lot of passion and a lot of genuine concern and sincerity about what's happening in this community. It's obvious that it's well-founded. And in the Interior Department looks forward to working with the Congressman and the state and Water Management District and the Corps to do what we can to help everyone expedite the process that will lead to a solution that will have really healthy estuary in San Luis. And personally, I look forward to coming back one of these days and going and fishing for some sailfish. So I hope that you'll be seeing me again, but before too long, and have an opportunity to take advantage of the great resources that you have here in the Stuart area.
Again, thanks, and thanks to all of you for sharing with us your time, and for the specific speakers, your input. Colonel Reynolds, anything before we close out?
So I just wanted to thank the panel and all of the public. There will be a press opportunity with Colonel Kirk and Congressman Mast. So press who are interested in the press availability opportunity, you can go around the building out by the waterfront, and the Colonel and the Congressman will be available to the press for a few moments. I do have to get several people to the airport very shortly. And so I appreciate the press keeping the comments to within the time limit that we discussed earlier. Thank you very much for everyone attending. We appreciate your time and your patience. Thank you.